She swept floors while they swept past her, until one waltz made them all stop breathing. They had mocked her accent, her clothes, her calloused hands. But when the music started, she became the one thing none of them could ever be: truly elegant. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the marble floor of the Thornfield mansion as Liana Rodriguez pushed her cart through the grand ballroom. The wheels squeaked, a sound she'd grown to hate, marking her presence like a bell around a stray cat's neck. Steam rose from her bucket, carrying the sharp scent of industrial cleaner that seemed to follow her everywhere, a reminder that she belonged to the world of mops and rags, not silk and champagne. The charity gala preparations buzzed around her. Event coordinators in designer suits swept past without acknowledgement, their conversations about flower arrangements and wine selections flowing over her as if she were furniture. She'd learned to make herself smaller in these moments, shoulders hunched, eyes down. The less space she occupied, the fewer opportunities for the inevitable comments about her thick accent, or the way her secondhand uniform never quite fit properly. "Excuse me." The voice cut through her invisibility. Victor Thornfield, the tech mogul hosting tonight's event, stood blocking her path. His tailored tuxedo probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Behind him, a cluster of donors and socialites paused their pre-event cocktails, sensing entertainment. "You're the cleaning girl, right?" Victor's smile held no warmth. The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Liana nodded, her fingers tightening around the mop handle until the plastic creaked. "Tell me something," Victor continued, his voice carrying across the ballroom's perfect acoustics. "Where exactly did you learn English? I'm having trouble placing that unique pronunciation." The crowd tittered. Someone's iPhone screen glowed as they started recording. Heat crawled up Liana's neck. She'd heard variations of this performance before: the mock curiosity, the theatrical confusion about her accent, the way they made her existence feel like an inconvenience requiring explanation. "Venezuela," she said quietly. Venezuela." Victor nodded sagely, as if this explained everything. "And I suppose back there, everyone dreams of coming to America to clean floors?" The laughter that followed felt like glass breaking. Liana's chest tightened. The familiar shame crept in. Shame for her accent, her job, her secondhand clothes that never quite matched. But underneath it, something else stirred. A memory of other floors, other lights, other audiences who had once risen to their feet for her. "Actually," a new voice interjected, "I believe the lady has other talents." Dr. Marcus Webb stepped forward from the crowd. The renowned music professor from Juilliard had been hired to oversee the evening's entertainment, but something in Liana's posture, the way she held herself despite the mockery, had caught his attention. Victor's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, really? And what talents might those be?" Dr. Webb studied Liana carefully. There was something in her stance, a particular way she held her head, that reminded him of the dancers he'd worked with at Lincoln Center. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we could find out. The orchestra is set up for rehearsal. Why don't we see if our friend here would care to demonstrate?" The suggestion hung in the air like a dare. Victor's eyes lit up with cruel anticipation. This was even better than he'd hoped. Not just a verbal humiliation, but a physical one. "Excellent idea. What do you say, Liana? Care to show us what Venezuela taught you about dancing?" The crowd gathered closer. Phones appeared. Someone dimmed the overhead lights, leaving only the chandelier's warm glow. The ballroom suddenly felt like a coliseum. Liana set down her mop. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied her cleaning apron, revealing a simple black dress underneath. Nothing elegant, but it would have to do. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for the stumble, the embarrassment, the confirmation of their assumptions about who she was and where she belonged. Dr. Webb signaled the small orchestra. The opening notes of Strauss's Blue Danube began to fill the space, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. Something shifted in Liana's body as the music reached her. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted. The calluses on her hands from years of cleaning suddenly felt familiar in a different way. She remembered how they'd helped her grip her partner during lifts, how they'd marked hours of practice, dedication, perfection. She began to move. It started simply, a step, a turn, nothing dramatic. But there was something in the precision of her placement, the extension of her arms, that made the whispered conversations die away. By the eighth measure, she had transformed the empty space around her into a stage. The years fell away. This wasn't the Thornfield Mansion ballroom. This was the Teatro Municipal in Caracas, where she'd been principal dancer with the National Ballet until the accident that shattered her ankle and her career. This wasn't an audience of skeptical donors. This was the crowd that had given her 17 curtain calls after her debut as Odette. She moved through the waltz like she was painting with her body, each gesture precise, emotional, inevitable. The music seemed to respond to her, the orchestra unconsciously adjusting their tempo to match her breathing. What had started as mockery became something else entirely: recognition. The crowd had gone completely silent. Victor's smirk had vanished. Dr. Webb found himself holding his breath, realizing he was witnessing something extraordinary, not just technical skill, but the kind of artistry that couldn't be taught or faked. When the music ended, Liana held her final pose for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of air conditioning. Then, slowly, Dr. Webb began to applaud. Others joined, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. But Victor wasn't finished. His face had gone red with humiliation, but he forced another smile. "Well," he said loudly, "that was adequate, but anyone can memorize a few steps. Real dancing requires partnership, technique, years of proper training." He straightened his bow tie with theatrical confidence. "Perhaps I should demonstrate what classical training actually looks like," the crowd murmured uncertainly. Victor had taken lessons, everyone knew that, expensive private lessons with the best instructors money could buy. But there was something desperate in his challenge, something that made several guests suddenly find their drinks fascinating. "Richard," Victor called to the orchestra conductor, "another waltz, something with more complexity." Dr. Webb watched this unfold with growing unease, but the orchestra began again. This time, a more challenging piece with intricate rhythms and tempo changes. Victor stepped onto the floor with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. He began well enough. His posture was adequate, his basic steps memorized correctly. But as the music progressed, the difference became painfully obvious. Where Liana had been water, Victor was wood. Where she had breathed with the music, he fought against it. Halfway through, he stumbled slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to break the illusion of competence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Victor's face grew redder as he pushed through the remaining measures, his movements becoming more mechanical with each passing beat. When he finished, the applause was polite but hollow, the kind reserved for a child's piano recital. "Bravo," Liana said softly, and somehow her gentle praise stung worse than any criticism could have. That's when the ballroom doors opened and everything changed again. The man who entered was elderly, but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His white hair was swept back from a face lined with decades of music, and his eyes, dark and expressive, swept the room until they found Liana. The color drained from her face. "Papa?" The word escaped as barely a whisper. Maestro Carlos Rodriguez had been invited to conduct the evening's formal program, but he'd arrived early and heard music from the ballroom. He'd expected to find the usual pre-event rehearsal. Instead, he'd found his daughter, the daughter he'd believed dead for 8 years. "Liana." His voice broke on her name. The sophisticated crowd watched in stunned silence as the renowned conductor crossed the ballroom in quick strides and pulled his daughter into his arms. The story spilled out in whispered Spanish between them, how she'd survived the bombing that destroyed the theater, how her injuries had ended her dancing career, how she'd fled to America with nothing but determination and the clothes on her back, how pride and shame had kept her from reaching out to the family she'd thought might be ashamed of her fall from grace. Dr. Webb found himself wiping tears from his eyes as he watched the reunion. Around the ballroom, the earlier cruelty seemed to evaporate, replaced by something approaching shame. This wasn't just a cleaning lady who could dance. This was a celebrated artist whose talent had been disguised by circumstance and their own prejudices. Victor tried to salvage the situation. "Well," he said loudly, "this is all very touching, but I did make a promise contingent on a proper performance, and while that was entertaining, I hardly think the keys." Dr. Webb's voice cut through Victor's backpedaling. "You promised her the keys to the house if she could dance." That was obviously hyperbole. Was it? Maestro Rodriguez's voice carried the authority of decades, conducting world-class orchestras. because it sounded like a promise to me. And this room full of witnesses seems to agree. The crowd began to murmur, not mockingly now, but with growing indignation at Victor's attempt to renege. Social pressure in this circle was a powerful force, and Victor suddenly found himself on the wrong side of it. "The keys, Victor." This from Margaret Astor, the matriarch of old New York society whose opinion could make or break reputations. A gentleman keeps his word. Trapped by his own public theater, Victor reached into his jacket pocket. The keys to the Thornfield mansion were heavy in his hand, not just pieces of metal, but symbols of power, prestige, generations of accumulated wealth. Handing them to a woman he'd tried to humiliate felt like surrendering something fundamental about the order of things. But the crowd was watching, cameras were recording, and his reputation hung in the balance. He placed the keys in Liana's palm with as much grace as he could manage. "Congratulations," he said through gritted teeth. The applause this time was thunderous, genuine, redemptive. Dr. Webb approached Liana as the crowd began to disperse. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Juilliard is starting a new program, bringing world-class artists into our dance therapy initiative. Artists who understand both the heights of success and the struggle of starting over. Would you be interested?" Liana looked down at the keys in her hand, then at her father, then at the ballroom where she'd been humiliated and then redeemed, all in the space of one evening. "I would be honored," she said. 3 months later, the mansion's ballroom had been converted into a dance studio. The chandelier still hung overhead, but now it illuminated not charity galas, but dance classes for underprivileged children. Liana's old mop bucket sat in a place of honor in the corner, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change, how talent could be hidden in the most unlikely places. On quiet evenings, when the last student had gone home, Liana would sometimes take the floor alone. She'd play the same Strauss waltz that had changed everything, and dance for an audience of memories, for the girl she'd been in Caracas, for the woman she'd become in New York, for all the invisible people still waiting to be seen. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9. Through the tall windows, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Liana held her old cleaning rag, the one item she'd kept from her invisible days, and made a quiet promise to the empty room. "May we learn to see the dancers hidden among the janitors, the poets disguised as cashiers, the teachers working as waitresses. May we remember that grace comes in work clothes, and talent speaks every language." She folded the rag carefully and placed it in the display case Dr. Webb had installed, a reminder that extraordinary things lived in ordinary moments, waiting for someone wise enough to notice. Talent wears no uniform and speaks in every accent. Remember this story when you meet someone the world has taught you not to see.